Okay, ready, guys? Ready? I don't think I'm ready. Holy cow. Okay. Can't be yawning on camera. Wonder how the hosts of those like morning shows do it, you know? They're all fresh and excited and wearing suits and their hair is done just so, and I wonder how they do it. Probably get up at like 3 in the morning. Okay. Are you ready? Okay, here we go. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday. As we look out the window, it's actually a pretty nice day out in Vancouver. The rain has stopped momentarily, but we'll be back. That's the look on Beatrice's face. Like, yeah, it'll be back. Whatever. Yes, let's say hello to people who are here. Ayushi is here. Good morning, Ayushi. And Ananda's here. Hello, Ananda. Michaela's here. Good morning, Michaela. Ryan is here. Good morning. Kevin is here. Good morning, Kevin. Hadil is here. Hi, Hadil. Shania is here. Good morning, Shania. And Helen is here. Good morning, Helen. Right. So yesterday we reviewed some reading. We watched some videos, some documentary footage, and we were kind of reviewing what happens in the Soviet Union. And so we said Khrushchev was pushed aside. They felt the Communist Party wasn't entirely happy with his leadership or his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Domestic problems inside the Soviet Union continued to be the same domestic problems, and spoiler alert, will continue to be the same domestic problems, but we'll get to that. And so he gets pushed aside in favor of this guy, Leonid Brezhnev. And we saw Brezhnev in the video yesterday. He's not an incredibly handsome fellow, I'm afraid, but yeah, not your type. No, okay. He looks vaguely toad-like, but regardless of what he looks like, I don't want to judge his appearance here. Brezhnev has some issues to deal with in the Soviet Union, right? He needs to figure out how to deal with the West. He needs to deal with the sort of social and economic changes, but I guess negative situation at home. And he's got to gain some sort of control over Soviet bloc countries. And as we see, they're increasingly starting to push back against the Soviet Union, right? So for years after the end of World War II, things were reasonably country in those Eastern Bloc countries, but reasonably quiet in those Eastern Bloc countries. But since Khrushchev's 20th Party Congress speech, where he says, oh, there's many roads to socialism. We're not going to do things like Stalin anymore. We're not just going to execute people and send them to the gulag. We're going to be nicer to them. And I mean, he still sends in the Red Army sometimes, but that leads these Eastern Bloc countries to start pushing back a little bit to try and get some more economic and social freedom, right? And so Brezhnev has to figure out how to deal with those. We said that the Soviet economy is kind of a mess. They've been dumping huge amounts of money into their weapons program, their military and their nuclear weapons program, trying to achieve parity with the US, which they more or less have. But of course, that's been at the expense of Soviet citizens who have, just the basics in terms of food to eat. They have very little in terms of consumer goods, and so they're kind of living a quality of life equal to Americans in the 1920s. But again, this is in the mid-1960s, right? Food shortages continue to occur. The collectivization of agriculture remains inefficient and ineffective. And so the Soviets are actually borrowing huge amounts of money just to kind of keep afloat. And again, that's not a good thing to do if you're a country, especially if you have no plan to get out of debt, which currently they do not, right? Their entire plan is almost like it's almost like the people who, you know, their retirement plan is, oh, we're going to win the lottery. That's not a good retirement savings plan. You're not going to win the lottery. And it's kind of the same thing with the Soviets here. They're thinking, oh, eventually socialism will work, right? Eventually socialism will work, and then we'll get out of this situation that we're in. And spoiler alert, that it's not going to work for them, at least not this way. So again, there's these Eastern Bloc countries like Czechoslovakia are pushing for reforms. Alexander Dubček, party secretary, suggests a bunch of things. Brezhnev says, no thank you, rolls in with the Red Army, pushes Dubček out of power, and installs his own Moscow-friendly party secretary, right? So all of these things like freedom of speech, freedom of travel, freedom of the press, man, that's a lot of freedom, hey? All of those things, freedom from censorship, all of those things were to be formalized by the Czech Communist Party, but Brezhnev isn't having any of it, right? So he rolls in, quashes these proposed reforms, and kind of issues a Truman doctrine of his own called the Brezhnev doctrine. It's a little derivative, but you know, whatever. And he says, yeah, that the Soviet Union has the right to intervene in any country in which a counter-revolution might threaten socialism, right? And so, and he's going to do that, right? We talked a little bit about Poland experiencing economic problems in the 70s and into the 80s, and there was lots of labor strikes. There was attempts to increase the price of goods, which the people didn't like. There was more strikes, and finally we get this Gdansk shipyard union recognized as a trade union, right? And after that, the Soviets actually grant all other professions to have their own union as well, right? Which is, from their perspective, a bit of a mistake, right? Because eventually all of these trade unions will unify with each other, and then they're one trade union with 8 million people in it. And so, again, major leverage, right? Major power. Basically unheard of in a communist system, because now, you know, there's this trade union negotiating with the government. That's not really how it's supposed to be in communism, but here we are, right? And so Władysław Gomulka, the General Secretary of the Polish Communist Party, is negotiating with Solidarity, but eventually he's replaced by General Jaruzelski. I always have a problem with his name. Jaruzelski, who's a little bit of more of a hardliner. He's tough, and he says, I'm not negotiating with you. You want too much. I'm arresting a bunch of you and throwing you in jail. The end, right? So that is kind of the end of Solidarity for a little while anyway. But as I say, never fear, they will be back. I asked you to read this section of the textbook, did I not? And I think we just didn't manage to do it, right? We just didn't manage to talk about the questions. So let's talk about those now. Yeah. You had what? You had one more page to read? Okay. I'm going to give you 4 minutes to have another look, and then we'll talk about it, okay? 4 minutes. Okay, good people. So the first question I asked you here is 9, but it's actually, the answer for 9 comes just a little bit before this section. It's just in the paragraph before. But does anyone have a question and answer for number 9 here, with the key issues in the conflict between the Soviet Union and China? And we haven't dealt with China yet, but I think we've kind of heard enough in sort of the global history to know that China is going to have kind of a communist revolution of their own. And so we've read a little bit about the beginning of China, and we had a struggle between Mao's communist and Jiang Jiexi's nationalists, right? And so Mao is going to win that battle, and he's going to proclaim the People's Republic of China in 1949. And so from 49 onward, Mao is going to try to kind of get communism going in China in a similar way that Lenin and then Stalin tried to get communism going in the United States. But here we are in about the mid-1960s, where Mao is still in power and China is still strongly communist, but the Soviets and the Chinese are having some difficulties in their relationship. What are the problems in their relationship? Almost. So, what did China actually really want to develop? Yeah, they wanted nuclear weapons, right? And the Soviet Union was saying, no, we're not giving you that technology, right? But the Soviets had been supplying them with all kinds of weapons and science and technology really since the beginning of the People's Republic in 1949. So a lot of China's early kind of technology and scientific help actually came from, and money actually came from the Soviet Union. Once Mao kind of proclaimed a communist country, the Soviet Union was only too happy to assist them with whatever they needed. But that relationship had kind of soured a little bit. So yeah, the Chinese wanted nuclear technology, and the Soviets wouldn't give it to them, even though the Soviets had been helping them with military and science and technology for quite some time. What else? Why else had their relationship soured? Right, so they had some border disagreements about where the border between the Soviet Union and China was, and of course they have a few little encounters which leads to an armed or a fortified border. Okay, so there's that. What else? I think there's one more thing. Yeah, what's the deal with the ideological leadership thing? Yeah, so the Soviet Union still sees itself, and probably rightly so, as kind of the center of the communist world and the leader of the communist world. And so Moscow likes to sort of direct all of these other communist countries to do what they tell them. But Mao has been in power now for, I don't know, 15 years or so, and he has his own goals, right? He has his own way of doing communism. He has his own kind of agenda for his country and who he wants to make friends with and who he wants to fight with, and he has all of these things that he wants to do, and he doesn't really want to listen to what Moscow says. And even further, he wants to be seen as a leader of the communist world as well. And so he sees himself right up there with, with Lenin and Stalin and Mao, right? He sees himself in that sort of pantheon of communism gods, if you will. But the Soviets don't see him that way. They think he's kind of like a second-rate communist. He's not really doing communism. They're supportive of him, but they don't really have a lot of respect for him. And so there's this kind of, it's almost like, you know how with your parents, sometimes your parents tell you what to do, right? Yeah, Eliana's like, all the time. Yeah, sometimes your parents tell you what to do, right? And you kind of have to do what they say, number one, because they're your parents, but number two, because they're supporting you, right? Like, where does all of your money and clothes and food come from? Parents, right? So you're kind of stuck, right? Because you kind of have to listen to them because you kind of need them to provide all this stuff for you, right? And you can't just say, well, screw you, parents, I'm just going to go off and do what I want, because you can't, right? Maybe in a few years you can, but right now you can't. And that's kind of exactly the situation that Mao is in here, is that Mao really relies on the Soviet Union for science and tech and for money, but he doesn't want to listen to what the Soviet Union is telling him to do. He doesn't want to listen to what mom and dad tell him. So he's kind of in this position where he needs the Soviet Union, but he doesn't want to listen to what the Soviet Union is telling him to do. And it's kind of it's a very similar situation for him. But again, unfortunately, or not unfortunately, but eventually that relationship will cool to the point where the Soviets will actually start pulling all their stuff out of China. So all of their military scientists that are helping the Chinese out and academics, all of those people will be pulled out of China, and then China will start to lean over towards the US and try to make friends with the US. And we saw that in the video yesterday with Richard Nixon going to China and that sort of ping-pong diplomacy thing they were doing. That's kind of after the Soviet Union kind of washes its hands of China, and China starts to lean over towards making friends with the US. Good? You look like you had a question. You okay? Okay. All right, on to number two. Oh, shoot. Why did the United States reestablish a relationship with China? Well, we know half of that answer, right? Because the Soviets had kind of pulled out, and China needed a new friend, and so they started to talk to the United States. But why did the United States want to be friends with China? Hmm? Yes, but why did they want to mend that relationship? China, we want you back. We'll do anything. We didn't mean all those things we said. Take us back, China. What?
China's big, has a lot of people.
It's it's big. It has a lot of people. Yeah, it wasn't.
Huge labor force.
Yeah, it was, but it wasn't. That wasn't the relationship. Like now China is a major manufacturing hub. There's literally billions of people in China, or a little more than a billion people, working and manufacturing, and they're an important part of the global economy. At the time, not so much, right? Not so much. But the U.S. had other plans or other goals.
Better for it to be us than against us.
Yeah, right. So the Chinese are still a communist country, and to have the Soviet Union and China stuck to, no, not in America yet, but to have the Soviet Union and China allied, and to have this huge kind of geographic block with millions and millions and millions of people, all communists, terrifying, right? But if the US can kind of drive a wedge between China and the Soviet Union and kind of make friends with China, well, that's good, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? And so they may not, the Americans may not like communist China, but they like the Soviet Union even less. And so if they can establish some sort of good relationship with China, that means that at least China is kind of a little more on the US team than on the Soviet team. And that's good for them at the moment. I'm not sure that they really were super into being friends with China, but it was better than China being friends with the Soviet Union, I think. What about 11 here? Oh yeah, the Helsinki Accords. We saw those Helsinki Accords signed in the video yesterday, and so Gerald Ford was talking, and I forget who the Russian guy. So Gerald Ford said it was a ticking time bomb for the Soviets, and one of the Soviet signatories, he said, "Oh, it's just a piece of paper. Don't worry." But what are these Helsinki Accords? It's like the Sokovia Accords, except not. Yeah, what are the Helsinki Accords? Not the Sokovia Accords, those are different. What are the Sokovia Accords? Mm-hmm. So after years of diplomatic negotiations, we've got.
I was about to say that's the 10 years of diplomatic negotiation between the Soviet and the West.
Yes.
Accord.
Right. So kind of like the end product of a lot of conversations between the West and between the Soviets and kind of other countries that fall into their spheres, right? And so they kind of sit down at these in Helsinki, Finland. That's why they're called Helsinki Accords, to sign these and just kind of formalize their agreements, right? Formalize what they've talked about and decided over the past 10 years. So there's kind of three main parts to these accords. And what's the first main part? Okay, questions relating to security in Europe. And so what's that kind of about? What is sort of confirmed by that section of the Accords?
Kind of like formalize the border in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
But that wasn't really good for Brezhnev because his doctrine wasn't exactly the same as that.
Right. So there's a couple. Yeah. So the Soviets in this, it's kind of a win-lose for the Soviets, right? So in the first part of the Accords, everybody agrees that these are now the permanent borders of countries in Europe. They are inviolable. You can't just roll into other countries unannounced. The borders are permanent. You can't just change them willy-nilly. They're set, right? The borders are now set. And so in part that's good for the Soviets because that's what they wanted. They wanted the West to sort of officially recognize those borders, because they didn't really get around to it at the end of World War II. However, it's also a bit of a problem for the Soviets because it says in the accords that the borders are inviolable, right? Which means you can't just go into another country's borders without their permission, right? You have to knock and ask nicely. You don't just roll in with your tanks. But the BREZHNEV doctrine says that's exactly what you do, right? If communism is under threat, you roll in with your tanks. And so here BREZHNEV has kind of signed on the dotted line, but he's promised that borders are inviolable, that you can't just roll over them with your tanks. But of course, is he going to keep that promise? So again, the first part is a bit of a win-lose for the Soviets, right? They get recognized borders, but it also means that they can't just walk over those borders whenever they want. Remains to be seen if they will. What's the second part? Yeah, cooperation in the fields of technology and environment? Oh, okay, science and economics. Okay, right. So what is that? What happens in that section? Right. So nothing major comes out of this section, but they do. Yeah, the powers seem to recognize that some amount of international cooperation in these fields is probably a good thing. So that's okay. Not much comes out of it, but it's better to agree on something than not to, right? What about the third one? The question of what? Cooperation in humanitarian and other fields. Okay, so what happens in this section?
So they agreed to like keep watch on one another and like make sure they're treating others in humanitarian ways. It was pointed at the Soviets mostly. They promised that they'll allow freer movements, but then we saw what happened.
Yes. So this is So in this section of the Helsinki Accords, the two sides are basically saying, okay, we know that we know the human rights are a thing, right? The Declaration of Human Rights from the UN came out in 1948. They're a thing. Let's all agree that human rights are important and that all countries should respect the human rights of their citizens, right? And so on and so forth. And so everybody signs on to this. But of course, this is a little weird for the Soviets because they are frequent abusers of violators of human rights. And so this is where that Soviet diplomat says to Brezhnev, he's like, yeah, don't worry, this is just a piece of paper. Doesn't matter. Right? But Gerald Ford, the American president, says this is a ticking time bomb for the Soviets because now they have agreed that they're going to respect human rights. And if they don't, it's going to look bad, right? They'll be in violation of this international accord. Of course, there will be no punishment for it because there usually isn't, right? This is just a friendly agreement. But still, it's going to look bad, right? So this section's a bit of a win for the Americans, right? To get the Soviets to at least admit that human rights exist and that they should be respected, right? Again, whether they will or not is another question, but at least they have admitted that, right? Right. Okay, and number 12, I think we've kind of just done that, right? With the significance for both of these countries is that the USSR gets its borders confirmed, and the US gets the Soviets to say they're going to respect human rights. Whether they do is something else, but they say they're going to, right? Let's see. Yes. The invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. So the Soviets choose to invade Afghanistan in 1979. Why do they do this? What's that? To make what? To make the USA angry? It did.
Story behind it. So
And it's a long story, right?
so what happened was that Afghanistan was close to the USSR. They actually shared a border, but it was under constant aid by both the US and the Soviets. They were closer to the Soviets, so more aid came from them.
Mm-hmm.
Some factions showed up, the monarchy was overthrown, factions showed up. Bit by bit, the new government started to slide towards apparently my country, who were pre-America, pro-America. And then what happened was that some other backstabbing, betrayals, overthrowings, executions and stuff happened in Afghanistan. And the Soviets decided, okay, we don't want a neighbor in turmoil. So they invaded Afghanistan. They defeated the actual army that existed, but then the guerrilla resisting, yeah, they gave up.
Yeah, so it's a complicated situation because there's a lot of internal politics going on inside Afghanistan that of course you would need to understand to really know the story. And for our purposes that's a little too much, right? And so things start off with Afghanistan again sharing a border with the Soviet Union, with Afghanistan being kind of strategically important to the Soviets, and with the Soviets having a reasonably good relationship with the government. But of course, they get a change in government, and gosh, now I gotta remember how it works. Is the new government unfriendly to the Soviets? Because there's a change in leadership, and then there's a coup that happens after,
Yeah.
and then there's almost like a civil war going on, and then yeah, and then the Soviets kind of move in to support the communist, the sort of communist party that is trying to take power, or the Marxist party that's trying to take power. And so again, that the upshot of this is that the Soviet Union is trying to keep a communist government in Afghanistan so that they can be friendly with it and be allied with it. And so they're trying to support this one side. Again, it's a bit of a complicated situation, but how does that war go for them? What's that? Yeah, how does the war go?
The
Good.
Soviets held the cities and major urban areas,
Mm-hmm.
but the countryside was controlled by the Mujahideen
Mm-hmm.
and other people. So the thing with Afghanistan is that, imagine Afghanistan like, take a bowl.
A bowl?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that would be Afghanistan. All around it is mountains, and then it's just right there in the middle of the country, a bit of flat land, valleys basically. All these guerrilla fighters and all, they were hiding in the mountains, and so the Soviets tried to kill them, tried whatever they could, but every time they got kicked badly. So yeah, they were trying to fight a conventional army, but not a guerrilla force. The same thing happened with the Americans later in Afghanistan.
Yeah. So.
The Americans? No. No. They keep get shot at all the time.
Yeah, nobody. Yeah, so there's two things. So the number one is that the Soviets move in, I think on Christmas Day. Merry Christmas, Afghanistan. They roll in with their tanks, and they take the capital city of Kabul very, very quickly and easily. What's that? Parachuters. They take the city fairly quickly, and usually this is kind of how you go about it, right? You move into a country, you take the capital city, capture the government and the leadership, and then you're usually good to go, right? But it doesn't really work that way in Afghanistan because the power is so decentralized, right? And again, you can take the city and you can capture the government and throw them in jail or execute them or whatever you want to do, but not everyone is listening to that government or the government you're supporting or any other government. And so you can take control of the city, but the countryside doesn't really care, right? There's all kinds of other rebels and mujahideen and all kinds of people out there who are kind of fighting the war independently on their own terms. And so you've got to kind of go around and defeat each one of those other guys. You can't just, you don't just sort of cut the head off of the leader and then, that's it. You've got to defeat everybody. And as you've mentioned, Afghanistan is a tough place to fight in, right? It's very mountainous. There's people hiding in hills and caves. And of course, these people know their land much better than the Soviets do. And so the Soviets are not really equipped or trained to fight kind of a guerrilla war as the Afghans are waging on them. What's that?
Afghans are really strong. They're inside.
Yeah, so the Soviets are kind of not prepared to fight a war like this. And again, guerrilla wars are hard to fight and hard to win, which of course the Americans find out in Afghanistan, but also in Vietnam, right? Because the Vietnamese fight a guerrilla war against the Americans, and the Americans are eventually forced to just leave because they can't win, right? Unfortunately, Vietnam kind of takes a bit of a beating in the process, but the Americans eventually have to leave because they can't win it. Right. So things don't go well for the Soviets. They capture the capital city. They sort of support their government, but of course there's all kinds of rebels in the hills that they have to deal with, and they're not really able to deal with them very well. And so what's going to happen eventually? Yeah, eventually they're going to give up, right? Eventually they're going to say, we can't win this. We don't even know why we're here. It doesn't matter. We can't afford this. We're out.
How long they fought in Afghanistan?
Almost 10 years.
So they had to fight 10 years?
The Soviets are in there for 10 years. And again, this is it's probably a problem for any government, but I think it's particularly an issue with the Soviets. And I've mentioned this before, is that communism has to be seen as working, right? And in order for communism to work, the Communist Party, and particularly the communist leader, has to be seen as strong and competent and successful, right? And so to go into a country like Afghanistan, which was, very sort of had low levels of kind of technological development, wasn't really seen as an equal nation in the Soviet Union, to go into a country like that and to lose, humiliating, right? Embarrassing. And the Soviets don't like to be humiliated or embarrassed. And so they stay there much longer than they really should, right? Their kind of pride, if you will, keeps them fighting in Afghanistan, trying to win a war that they can't win, that they can't afford, that has no point, and that they're kind of too proud to pull out and to just say, you know what, this is a lost cause.
In between 10 years, there was a change of governments, right?
There's a few different leaders, and so Brezhnev will start the war. Yuri Andropov will continue it. Konstantin Chernenko will also continue it, but of course those guys only live for a year each, so they don't have time to do very much. And then Mikhail Gorbachev will end it.
The war ends in 1989. 2 years later, by
2 years later, what?
Soviets are gone.
Yeah. So, but yeah, they're there for 10 whole years fighting this war. And again, it's called like the Soviet Union's Vietnam, right? Because the US gets involved in Vietnam for a very similar reason. They're trying to oppose a communist takeover of Vietnam, but they kind of roll into Vietnam attempting to overthrow the communists. And again, they find that they're in a war that they can't win, right? The Vietnamese know their land, they know how to fight, and the Americans are just not able to overcome them. And eventually, and there's a bit of pride there as well, but the Americans eventually decide that, okay, this is a lost cause. A lot of people in the United States, which we may see in the video today, are protesting against the Vietnam War and asking questions like, what are we doing there? Why are we destroying these people's country? What is the point of all this? Why are all of our young men going over there and dying? Why, right? And so eventually the Americans will leave Vietnam unsuccessful as well. And so here it's kind of a same situation. Both the Soviet Union and the Americans get involved in another country trying to support their desired form of government. But unfortunately, neither power is able to overcome the sort of will and the strength of the people. And so both of them have to give up in the end. But it takes the Soviets a little longer to admit defeat than the Americans. Yeah. Okay. Let me see.
When they say Afghanistan the money they used in capturing basically by way too much.
Say that one more time.
Like when they say the cost for Afghanistan in the war.
Yeah.
In capturing.
For Afghanistan. Yeah. So this is the other thing too, is that this is kind of this is not a beneficial war for the Soviet Union, right? They don't really get anything out of it, especially since they don't actually win. It costs them a lot of money, and it's money that they don't have. But of course, for Afghanistan, Afghanistan has to sort of suffer through a decade of being bombed by the Red Army until the Soviets finally leave, right? And so, it's not very helpful for Afghanistan either, right? Afghanistan doesn't come out of this conflict any better than they went in, and this is nothing that they asked for, right? This was an internal squabble between different factions trying to sort of form a government in Afghanistan, and then the Soviet Union invited themselves to the party, right? And again, they didn't make it any better. And you could probably say the same thing of the Americans in Vietnam, is that the Vietnamese had, they had sort of their own, issue of, would the communists take control of Vietnam and form a government there? And the U.S. kind of invited themselves to the party and didn't make it any better, right? They of course made it much worse, which also is another thing that countries continue to do, is they continue to invite themselves to the conflicts in other countries and usually make them worse in the process. Syria, right?
In Afghanistan, the government was taken down, right?
In where?
In Afghanistan.
Um,
Then where did they get all the money to fight back, with Soviet? Because the main government was taken down.
I'm
How
not
did they manage so much money?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure who was supplying the other factions in Afghanistan. I'm sure that other countries were connected to the rebels who were fighting the Soviets. I almost have an inkling that the Americans were involved in some way, but I don't remember the details very well. But I'm sure someone was supporting.
Yeah, someone has to support it for 10 years.
Someone was supporting the other factions for sure. Definitely.
Wasn't the U.S. could have Pakistan? That was the only country in the region that was free to bomb.
Could be. Could be. But yeah, they definitely had support. Okay, let's take a little bit of a break. I know it's a little bit on the early side, but we'll take a little bit of a break, and then we'll come back, and then I think we'll talk about Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev. Yeah.
Syria, before the whole ISIS thing, there was a civil war there, right? Did the Americans take the side of the rebels or the government?
Oh boy. Sorry, I'm gonna answer your question. Actually, I'm probably not gonna answer your question in a second, but I'm just gonna get to the right spot. So the question was for online people, and it's a question that I won't be able to answer very well, is what is going on in Syria, basically?
I think now they're still going on with their civil war, but like the civil war was there before ISIS showed up.
Yeah. So the civil war in Syria, as far as I know, and I'm probably going to get this wrong because it's a very complicated situation, and so to Syria and Syrians, I apologize in advance. But Syria was having a bit of a power struggle early on. So they had oh gosh, what's his name?
There was a guy called
Assad.
Then he died, then his son Bashar al-Assad took power.
Right.
His term expired, but he didn't feel like giving up power.
That's right. So Assad's son was in power. His term had ended. He didn't want to give up power, and so I think he claimed that he needed to stay in power because there was the country was unstable, and he needed to sort of, ensure that Syria didn't, slide into civil war. Of course, when he started to stay longer than his term, that kind of emboldened the rebels to say, "Hey, get out of office." The government starts to clamp down on the rebels. They get a bit of a civil war happening, and then you get everybody kind of dogpiling onto this conflict. The Americans, the Russians, the Turkey, Iran, everybody's in there.
I have another theory that they told the Americans, so we'll not use your money to exchange the oil. So to sell the oil, so we'll not take your money. We'll use our coins or something. And then they said, because what Americans do is they just print their money and they give it to Syria, and then this it's with Iran, Saddam Hussein.
I'm not sure about that, but certainly.
Because when Saddam Hussein died, we had in Bangladesh, so we were I saw my father and my uncles there, debating about them, and one is saying he's a good person, and others saying no, he's a bad person. So they were debating about that, and then.
I think based on what we know about him now, most people would probably say he was a bit of a bad person. But Saddam Hussein aside, so in Syria we start with a bit of a power struggle and maybe either an emerging civil war or at least the government kind of battling the rebels, and then again everyone else gets involved. Everyone else starts supplying troops and weapons to their preferred side. And then it gets really ugly, right? And again, Syria gets destroyed in the process of this whole thing.
Do you know which side the Americans took? Because I know that we took the government side.
Yeah, the Americans took the opposite side.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so the Americans don't support Assad. Okay, where are we? Okay, so we're done with Afghanistan. Let me see what's next. Oh yeah, okay. So I'm just going to go through this. I just had to change my slides up a little bit partway through because I'm just changing a little bit of the order that we're going in because we're on the clock. We're almost out of time with this class, right? So yeah, we said for the questions we just answered that ideological leadership for the communist world came from the Soviet Union, but China didn't really want to respect that. Mao had his own goals and wanted to be seen as a leader of the communist world as well. The Soviets didn't really see him that way. They kind of looked down on him. And again, once they started getting into border disputes and China didn't get the sort of nuclear technology from the Soviet Union that they wanted, they kind of started to grow apart, right? And so China starts to lean towards the United States. And again, the United States is only too happy to make friends with China, right? Not because they really like communist China all that much, but again, they prefer China as an ally rather than as an enemy, right? And so
Why
they
they
can.
prefer ally?
What?
Why they consider as China's ally?
Well, if the keep in mind this is a bipolar world, right? So you're basically with the Soviet Union or you're with the Americans. Although there's a lot of countries that are trying to stay out of it and are trying to be neutral. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But here, basically, if you're on one side or the other, right? And the Chinese were on the side of the Soviet Union, and so the chance to break up that communist bloc and, pull China closer to them, that's a win for the Americans, right? And who knows, maybe they can get some good information on the Soviet Union from the Chinese as well. You never know, right? But again, it's better to have China as an ally in this case than an ally of the Soviet Union, right? So the Americans will kind of snuggle up to them a little bit. We said the Helsinki Accords, after years of diplomatic negotiations, they do all these things. They confirm the borders of Eastern Europe. The accords contain a principle of non-intervention, which is again a win for the U.S. Whether the Soviets will respect it is a different story. They're going to cooperate in science and technology and economics. Fine, no big deal. And then cooperation in humanitarian areas. And again, that's a win for the U.S. as well. It gets the Soviets to admit that human rights exist and maybe that they'll respect them, hopefully. We say that the Soviets invade Afghanistan because of its strategic value and strategic location. Again, it's a complicated series of events. There's a coup, there's a dictatorship, there's another coup d'etat, there's more fighting and squabbling. Eventually it's kind of chaotic and the Soviets move in to kind of restore order and prop up their Moscow-friendly government. But of course, it doesn't go very well. Well, it goes well for a very short time as they take the capital city, but then they find that they cannot manage to defeat all of these rebels who are hiding in the mountainous areas of Afghanistan. And Afghanistan's a big country, right? So there's a lot of people hiding in the hills to deal with.
You said it was 2/3 of Alabama.
2/3 of Alabama? I don't know how big Alabama is.
400,000 square kilometers.
Yeah, that's a reasonable size. When it's all mountainous, it gets really big, right?
Those are all filled up with mountains and everything.
Yeah, so the Red Army will be there for 10 years, really to no benefit, right? They won't really get anywhere. Finally, they will kind of withdraw from the country and end the war. Again, the cost of this war, so the Soviets only lose about 15,000 soldiers, which is really not that many for a 10-year-long war. But look at the cost, right? This war costs them $12 million a day. And keep in mind that this is a Soviet Union that is borrowing money just to feed its people while it's engaging in an arms race with the United States. So this is a war that really the Soviets can't afford. And it's kind of stupid of them to get involved in it in the first place, but it's even dumber to continue for 10 years at a cost of $12 million a day. I quickly did the math here, and I don't know, is that $43 trillion? Is that what that is?
I don't think that they spend that much money on Afghanistan.
There's a lot of, what's that?
They would spend that much money on Afghanistan.
They did.
Wow.
So 43 billion and 800 million.
No, it's trillion.
Is that what that is?
It is the billion.
It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money, right? Especially,
For a 10-year long war?
and especially, and it's in 1980s dollars too, right? So that's 40 years ago. So factor in
4 trillion.
factor in your inflation. Is it just 43 billion, 800 million?
Let's count it. 1, 2, 3, and then you get 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1 million, 10 million, 100 million.
There you go.
Ah,
Billions and billions.
million.
There you go. 43 billion.
43
44. Let's round up. Let's round up to 40. What's another $200 million, right? 44 billion, right? Over 10 years. Again, and they don't have this money. The Soviets don't have this money. Ridiculous.
So
Plus,
where they got this money?
They're borrowing. They're borrowing a lot of money at this point. Um,
43.
and- and again, we should also remember that Afghanistan suffers in this process too, right? This isn't a war that they asked for. They're just trying to, figure out who's going to be the government of the country, and they wind up, with a Soviet invasion because they're strategically useful. And again, their country gets destroyed and their people get killed as a result, right? And the same thing for Vietnam, right? Vietnam gets the same thing. Their country destroyed and their people killed just because of their strategic value to the United States.
Okay, so the strategic value of Vietnam, I get it. They feared the domino effect, so they went in. But what strategic value did Afghanistan have to the Soviets, other than that once they chaotically invaded?
I think it's because they just shared a border. They had a border, and so the Soviets like a buffer zone between them and anyone else. And so I think they preferred to have communist country there rather than someone supported by the West. Not a great reason. Okay, so let me just see. Let me check my slides here. Okay. I want to show you a little more of the video that we've been watching. And for online people, I'd like you to watch, I'd like you to watch from an hour and 51, which is where we left off yesterday, to, I don't want you to go all the way through to the end. Let's watch 15 minutes. So that'll be 9 and 6. So that'll be 2 hours and 6 minutes. That's where I want you to watch to, okay? So I just put that in the live chat, the YouTube live chat, and of course the video is on Microsoft Teams. So just watch 15 minutes more of the video from an hour and 51, and then we'll come back and talk about what we've seen. I don't know where 15 minutes ends off, but we'll find out. So online people, I'll let you do that. The video's in Microsoft Teams. Watch from 1:51 to 2 hours and 6, and then come back here and we'll just kind of close it out, okay? And same thing in here.
The only morality they recognize is what will further their cause.
By 1980, Ronald Reagan's crusade against communism had spanned 5 decades.
The crusade for freedom is your chance and mine to fight communism.
In 1947, he was the B-movie actor who railed against communist infiltration of Hollywood. 20 years later, as the governor of California, he defended America's war in Vietnam.
The ending of conflict is not so simple as just calling it off and coming home.
Yes, it is.
Because the price for that kind of peace could be 1,000 years of darkness for generations yet unborn.
In 1981, communism's old foe assumed a powerful new position. Just like in the movies, America's new president was ready for the final showdown.
We must realize that no arsenal or no weapon in the arsenals of the world is so formidable as the will and moral courage of free men and women. It is a weapon our adversaries in today's world do not have. It is a weapon that we as Americans do have. Let that be understood by those who practice terrorism and prey upon their neighbors.
The Cold War balance of power had shifted dramatically in favor of the Soviet Union during the 1970s. Reagan vowed to change that. He made no secret of his desire to destroy communism.
The West won't contain communism. It'll transcend communism. It won't bother to denounce it. It will dismiss it as some bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages are even now being written.
While critics cautioned against inciting the Russian bear, the Reagan administration made plans to win the Cold War. National Security Directive 75 outlined a strategy to reinvigorate the nation's military defense and encourage political change within the Soviet sphere. Only then, from a position of strength, not weakness, would the U.S. engage in diplomacy. President Reagan's defense proposal was bold and controversial. It called for an investment of $1.5 trillion over 5 years, the greatest military buildup ever in peacetime. New ships, tanks, fighter jets, and nuclear weapons for the American arsenal. And nuclear-tipped Pershing II missiles to strengthen America's NATO allies in Europe.
We must stand by all our democratic allies, and we must not break faith with those who are risking their lives on every continent from Afghanistan to Nicaragua to defy Soviet-supported aggression and secure rights which have been ours from birth.
In a policy known as the Reagan Doctrine, the president asserted America's right to support those who opposed communism wherever they might be. Breaking with the doctrine of containment, which had ruled U.S.-Soviet relations for decades, the Reagan Doctrine was designed to roll back communism. American military aid flowed to the Contra rebels in Nicaragua and other anti-communist resistance groups. The president authorized billions of dollars in arms for Mujahideen guerrillas battling Soviet troops in Afghanistan. With the help of American-made Stinger missiles, the ragtag militia turned the tide against the mighty Soviet army. While these far-flung conflicts became bleeding wounds for the Soviet Union, American aid bankrolled the human rights movement behind the Iron Curtain.
It is the democratic countries that are prosperous and responsive to the needs of their people.
Before the British Parliament, President Reagan made a bold prediction.
What I'm describing now is a plan and a hope for the long term. The march of freedom and democracy, which will leave Marxism, Leninism on the ash heap of history as it has left other tyrannies which stifle the freedom and muzzle the self-expression of the people.
By the end of his first term in office, defense spending reached $34 million per hour. The president said he was arming to disarm. An increasingly vocal minority said he was mad. The nuclear freeze movement argued that the president was leading the world toward nuclear war. 1 million freeze supporters converged on Central Park in 1982 to denounce the arms buildup. Reagan maintained that they had misjudged his intentions. He wanted to end communism, not the world, and he had a plan to do it.
Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive.
In March 1983, President Reagan proposed the creation of a space-based missile defense known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. The concept read like science fiction. Satellites patrolling the heavens, zapping incoming Soviet missiles with lasers.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
The press quickly dubbed the controversial plan Star Wars. Soviet leader Yuri Andropov denounced the American president for inventing new plans on how to unleash a nuclear war. Star Wars was decades from becoming a reality, but the Soviets saw it as an immediate threat. The Soviet Union was stretched to the breaking point. Fully half of its economic output was needed to keep pace with Reagan's arms buildup. They had neither the money nor the technological know-how to join the race for a space-based missile shield. Just months after the Star Wars announcement, an international crisis dramatized the sinister nature of what Reagan called the evil empire.
My fellow Americans, I'm coming before you tonight about the Korean airline massacre. The attack by the Soviet Union against 269 innocent men, women, and children aboard an unarmed Korean passenger plane.
In August 1983, Soviet air defenses shot down a commercial airliner that had drifted off course.
This was the Soviet Union against the world and the moral precepts which guide human relations among people everywhere.
It was a military blunder. Reagan asserted otherwise.
It was an act of barbarism, born of a society which wantonly disregards individual rights and the value of human life, and seeks constantly to expand and dominate other nations.
As Reagan's rhetoric reached a fever pitch, Andropov became convinced that the United States was preparing for a surprise nuclear attack on the USSR. When Reagan learned this, he was astonished. Do you suppose they really believed that? I don't see how they could believe that, but it's something to think about. The superpowers managed to avoid nuclear Armageddon for nearly 4 decades, but on November 20th, 1983, millions of Americans endured the unthinkable. The TV movie The Day After was a fictionalized depiction of nuclear war. But for President Reagan, it was a sobering glimpse at where the world might be headed.
More than 20 years ago, President Kennedy defined an approach that is as valid today as when he announced it. So let us not be blind to our differences, he said, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved.
Reagan decided he had pushed hard enough. It was time to try a new approach.
People don't make wars. People want to raise their children in a world without fear and without war. If the Soviet government wants peace, then there will be peace. Together, we can strengthen peace, reduce the level of arms, and know in doing so that we have helped fulfill the hopes and dreams of those we represent, and indeed of people everywhere. Let us begin now.
President Reagan's about-face, from warmonger to peacemaker, coincided with the death of the third Soviet leader in as many years. Reagan joked, "How can I get anywhere with the Soviets if they keep dying on me?" At 54 years of age, the new communist in charge was in no immediate danger of dying. Mikhail Gorbachev was university educated, reform-minded, with ideas and imagination. He seemed quite unlike the sinister, boorish, senile leaders who had preceded him. Gorbachev was determined to save the failing Soviet economic system and improve the lives of ordinary citizens without abandoning Marxism-Leninism. In November 1986, Gorbachev and Reagan met for the first time at a summit in Geneva, Switzerland. The mood was tense during official discussions. Gorbachev was ready to negotiate an arms reduction on condition that Reagan abandon Star Wars. The president wouldn't budge. But in private, the two leaders forged the beginnings of a personal relationship that would transcend ideology, geopolitical differences, and the Cold War itself. Geneva did not produce any arms limitation agreements, but it provided a historic breakthrough. Just 5 months later, an explosion ripped through reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Soviet Union. It was an environmental catastrophe, the worst nuclear disaster in history. It exposed a Soviet system that was shot through with corruption and incompetence. Gorbachev vowed immediate and radical change. The Soviet leader introduced glasnost, a move away from government secrecy toward openness, and perestroika, a dramatic economic, political, and social restructuring of the Soviet Union itself. And to pay for the reforms, Gorbachev knew he would have to abandon the arms race and seek an end to the Cold War. In December 1987, the seeds planted at Geneva a year earlier bore fruit. Reagan and Gorbachev signed a historic agreement to eliminate intermediate-range missiles in Europe. It was the first step on the road to dramatically reducing nuclear weapons stockpiles. Reagan and Gorbachev found common ground on the issue of nuclear abolition. In 1987, President Reagan traveled to West Germany to seek common ground on human rights. In front of the Berlin Wall, he made his appeal.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
For Ronald Reagan, the one-time Hollywood actor, it may have been his finest performance.
Oh, good. Nailed it. All right.
Can we turn on the lights?
Yeah, please. Actually, we have a little bit of time. Let's see. Okay. All right, so we are back. So we see a few things in that section of the documentary that we'll read about tomorrow. Number one, we see, of course, President Ronald Reagan being elected in the early 1980s. And again, he's tough on communism, right? And his plan seems to be to arm the United States to the teeth in order to talk peace, right? He's arming to disarm, right? Which some people would dismiss as, somewhat illogical, right? There's the sort of famous Einstein quote, although I don't know if he ever said it, you cannot simultaneously prevent and prepare for war, or something like that. Either way, that's what Reagan's approach is going to be, right? He's going to make sure that the United States is super armed, and then maybe they'll talk, right? But again, he seems to, in his second term, he seems to have a bit of a change of heart, right? And he's looking more at sort of reaching out his hands to the Soviet Union and trying to come to some sort of agreement, right? And of course, that's going to be very attractive to their new General Secretary, Mikhail Gorbachev, right? Because BREZHNEV is going to die, and then he'll be replaced by Yuri Andropov, who will die in a year, and then he'll be replaced by Konstantin Chernenko, who will also die within a year. And so finally, the Communist Party, again, because communism needs to appear strong, they're going to look for someone younger, right? Someone who's not going to die in a year. And so they find Mikhail Gorbachev, who's still quite young at 54, I think they say. And that's young. I know you think that's really old, but it's not. You're all wrong. So they're going to put Mikhail Gorbachev in power, and he, of course, is going to try to find an end to a Cold War, or to the Cold War, because as you can see, the Russians are kind of coming to a point where they just cannot afford it anymore, right? Half of their economic output goes to the military while their people struggle along at a basic level of existence, right? And it's just they can't keep it up anymore. There's the war in Afghanistan that's costing them millions of dollars a day, and they just, you know, they're kind of on the verge of bankruptcy, if you will. And so Gorbachev has to make some changes, and fortunately, he comes to power at a time where Ronald Reagan is like, look, let's talk, right? Let's work this out. And so we kind of have a time in history where both leaders are very motivated to come to a peaceful settlement, a peaceful agreement. And, you know, spoiler alert, but it's gonna happen, although not quite in the way that Mikhail Gorbachev imagines.
Troops were there, in Afghanistan.
I don't know for sure.
Because they spent $12 million.
125,000. I do have. Hang on here.
Well, it's 12 million just for ammunition, food, water.
But only 50,000 died, so there wasn't a lot of, you know, lot of troops. Because if 50,000 died, that means there was only few troops.
I can show you this. This is kind of where we are, or in terms of this nuclear arms race, or just arms race in general between these two countries, right? And you can clearly see the number of nuclear weapons that these countries have constructed is outrageous, right? Like, look at their nuclear stockpile. So this is, let's look at about 1980, the mid-1980s, right? Because that's where we are. Gorbachev will come to power in 85. It'll be kind of the beginning of Ronald Reagan's second term in 1985. So the Soviets here have a solid, I don't know, 45,000 nuclear weapons.
45,000.
Yeah, the Americans seem to have maybe about 30, where is that? Maybe about 25,000. That's a massive amount of destructive power, right? That is enough to destroy every city in the world, right? There's like ridiculous, right? Ridiculous stuff.
How big is one nuclear weapon?
So there's
They vary.
They're warheads. Warheads could be this big. They usually place a couple of warheads on missiles.
So our warheads can, you know, destroy a city.
2 or 3 missiles to destroy.
You know a lot of stuff about missiles.
What is the Cold War?
Yeah, so you can see here these graphics are just kind of comparing this military buildup. And so you can see tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. We've got, you know, potentially millions of troops ready to go, tens of thousands of tanks and artillery and planes and missiles. And, you know, all of this stuff is wildly expensive, right? Not even just to build it, but to keep it up, right? To sort of maintain it. And so massive amounts of money are being spent on both sides. The difference is, of course, that the Soviets can no longer afford this, right? The Americans, you know, they were a rich country and still are, and so they were able to dump this amount of money into their military, but the Soviet Union can't keep going like
The
this.
Soviet Union print their own money, like US. So
Yeah.
US, if they need money, they just print their own money.
Well, you can print your own money, but printing your own money devalues your currency. And so if you
For us, it's like we have to give the same amount of gold to the World Bank and then print money. But for US, they don't usually give gold.
No, the U.S. goes by a different standard, but it requires you to, you know, you really have to be careful that you don't overprint your currency. Because if you overprint it, it starts to lose value, and then you get inflation, and then, yeah. So, and it's happened to, I forget which, there was an African country, and I think it might be Zimbabwe, but I'm not sure. Where there was kind of a cash crisis, and so their leader, whoever it was at the time, decided he was just going to print money, and that would solve the problem. And the money went out and got into people's hands, but of course, because there was so much new money, prices for everything went up. And so eventually they had to they've actually, the country actually wound up issuing the world's only $1 trillion bill. And so people actually had a $1 trillion bill in their hand but it didn't buy anything because their currency was worth nothing. So you can't sort of, you have to be very careful how much money, how much currency you actually print. And if you overprint it, your currency can lose value, your prices will go up, you'll get inflation, and if that continues, then you can get yourself in a real bind, as I think Zimbabwe did, but I'm not sure. I can't remember if it was Zimbabwe or not. It was Zimbabwe, yeah. Yeah, so you can get yourself into trouble by printing too much.
So I get how the gold standard works, but like the Americans aren't on the gold standard. Standard, aren't they?
I don't know how their standard works, and I think oh boy, you're going to expose me as incompetent here. I think it basically, I think they kind of police it themselves, and I think that they have such a stable currency and economy that people are kind of willing to allow them to kind of guarantee their own currency. In the past, it was gold standard, right? So you would print the currency based on the amount of gold you had, because that kind of backed up the currency, that guaranteed the currency.
After the Twin Tower destroyed, they changed their.
It's prior to that.
Depression, the Great Depression, the 1930s.
There was a lot of gold in Twin Towers. After that destroyed, they
9/11.
didn't find any gold.
The 9/11 thing.
Yeah.
They got off the gold thing before the Second World War.
Yeah, so the Americans switch off the gold standard earlier, but again, I think, I don't know how they establish like the value of their currency and how much currency they print, but I think it's because their economy is so stable and their currency is accepted pretty much worldwide. I think everyone trusts them to be able to sort of guarantee their own currency without the gold standard, but I don't know exactly how they do it. That'd be a good, everybody does. It would be, that'd be a good question to research for me, because I don't actually know how they do it. Because you're right, they did deviate from that gold standard years ago, but lots of countries still follow it.
Canada's still on that standard?
I'm not really sure, maybe.
As far as I know.
Excellent, it's an excellent question. That I don't know. My macroeconomics is a little fuzzy.
I asked if BREZHNEV is still on the gold standard because I remember something happened in the 1980s, a financial crisis, where Australia asked BREZHNEV for help, but then, the British
Our
dragged the
country-
Australians down with them.
Like our country is maintained the gold standard, so they have to pay gold and the gold print money, like from Bangladesh. They do it that way. I don't know others. I know the US doesn't follow the gold rules. Other countries do.
Okay, I'll try to look into that for tomorrow because it's a good question. But until then, we're just about out of time here, so I will let you go. And tomorrow we'll come back, we'll talk about Gorbachev, we'll talk about Reagan, and maybe we'll even talk about a little bit about how the Soviet Union starts to slowly come apart at the seams. Yeah, but anyway, that's it for today. I'll see you all tomorrow. Goodbye.